So I wanted to provide a bit of a brief discussion on how the nuclear debates have evolved in the NATO context. As Stéfanie Carvin rightly pointed out, the last big opportunity for NATO as an alliance to revisit its deterrence and defense posture review in a very public way was back in 2012. And so the main question I was asking myself is whether we need to tweak or update that language. And certainly there's an opportunity in the summit communiques that are released every 2 years, and we're going to have a new summit in July. So I think that the time is right to revisit this question and answer this question of whether any updates are warranted. Just to build on what's already been said in terms of extended deterrence, we're really concerned with the commitment to intervene offensively or defensively on an ally's behalf. What needs to be clear here in the NATO context is that this is primarily in reliance to U.S. strategic nuclear forces, but also with the implicit security guarantees of the UK and France, who are two nuclear NATO members, but who don't necessarily make explicit security guarantees to NATO allies, but by their very presence may have a deterrent effect that contributes to overall NATO's capabilities. And I always make a point of the distinction between extended deterrence and then collective actor deterrence. So whereas extended nuclear deterrence guarantee rely on the strategic nuclear forces of these three nuclear allies, the collective actor deterrence component is how all 29 member states, no correction, France is not part of that discussion through the nuclear planning group, but how the entire alliance really contributes to consultations on nuclear matters and then contributes to nuclear sharing with special arrangements. So in addition to the consultations on nuclear policy, there's also an arrangement that's made whereby the United States has forward deployed what's sometimes referred to as either tactical nuclear weapons or non-strategic nuclear weapons in 5 European countries. And then the Allies' role is to provide the delivery mechanism, so dual capable aircraft to carry those nuclear missions. So just to give you an illustration of what that looks like in practice, these non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons, the B-61 bombs, are stored and maintained in 5 European countries, all NATO members, of course. And this is what NATO nuclear sharing looks like, this consultative mechanism within the NATO framework on the one hand, and then this nuclear sharing where NATO allies get to participate in a more practical manner to the fulfillment of NATO's nuclear doctrine. As part of the evolution of debates with regards to NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements were discussions around the B-61's need for a life extension program. And some observers, like Hans Christensen, for instance, with the Federation of American Scientists, commented that through these life extension programs, NATO was essentially upgrading its nuclear capabilities as the U.S. was refurbishing these bombs with better guidance tail kits. And these better guidance tail kits and improved accuracy, you could have smaller yield weapons, which would be, quote unquote, more usable and could reduce the nuclear thresholds. Those were parts of the debates when these life extension programs were announced. That was 2010, 2011. So I spoke about the nuclear sharing arrangements in practice, and I just want to comment on what the nuclear consultations look like in the NATO context. And I have a really hard time not including org charts in my PowerPoint presentation. So here's one that's homemade, but kind of sketches out what the different bodies are within the NATO context. So of course, nothing changes in terms of NATO's decision-making processes. The North Atlantic Council is the supreme decision-making body within the NATO context, and makes all decisions, including decisions over nuclear matters. But within the NATO structure, you also have the nuclear planning group. And here you can have meetings on a need-to basis by the ambassadors who represent the NATO countries. And again, we're excluding France from that. You also have an annual defense ministers meeting within that context of the nuclear planning group. Supporting the work of the nuclear planning group, you also have a high-level group, which is a group of experts that supports the NPG's work. And these group of experts are policymakers from the capitals as well as experts on nuclear matters. And then, of course, you have the NPG staff group who meet weekly to advance the work of the NPG through staff in the NATO headquarters. So now that I've provided a bit of the background to be able to distinguish between just general extended nuclear deterrence in a NATO context, nuclear sharing arrangements as an additional component to consider, and then the processes for consultations on nuclear matters, I thought I would give you an overview of how the discussions have evolved since the 2010 strategic concept, and this is the latest reference we have in terms of strategic concepts, and perhaps that is in need of an update. But in the strategic concept and all the way up to 2018, I think what strikes the casual observer is the consistency in language over the place and the role of nuclear weapons within NATO's deterrence and defense posture. You have language about deterrence remaining a core part of NATO strategy. There's language about the fact that so long as nuclear weapons exist, NATO will remain a nuclear alliance. But you did have in 2010 a nod paid to the Obama Prague speech in 2009, which declared an ambition to have a world free of nuclear weapons. So NATO kind of endorsed that vision in the strategic concept of 2010 with the acknowledgement that so long as nuclear weapons existed, NATO would remain a nuclear alliance. Then you also have a statement with regards to disarmament of non-strategic nuclear weapons. And it's important to note here, and perhaps I should have included a table that draws attention to the disparity in the stockpiles of non-strategic nuclear weapons if you compare the United States and Russia. And while the United States only has 500 or less of these non-strategic weapons, on the Russian side, it's estimated to be in the thousands. And so in the strategic concept, you have an opening for, or call to action, if you will, for greater transparency and confidence-building measures to start addressing this category of weapons. And of course, Russia's response to that has been that in order to start these types of deliberations, there would need to be a removal of American non-strategic nuclear weapons from European territory. And so they would need to be back on the homeland. The 2010 strategic concept also led the way for a mandate for NATO to re-examine its deterrence and defense posture review. And I think what's really important to mention here is that around 2010, the Secretary General Rasmussen at the time made a public declaration to the effect that certain NATO officials, certain NATO alliance countries were asking NATO to revisit the nuclear sharing arrangements and perhaps consider the removal of certain non-strategic nuclear weapons from European territories. And so this was also part of the impetus, part of the debates that were going on at the time in 2010, 11, and 12. And the big question on everyone's mind at the time was, would there be a change in these nuclear sharing arrangements? And of course, there had been lots of changes previously with the end of the Cold War, but any removal of American tactical nuclear weapons from these 5 European states that you saw on the map would send quite an important signal. And there was a bit of tension there within the alliance and some disagreement where on one side you had countries like Germany and Netherlands and Luxembourg, and Norway as well, who were calling on the removal of tactical nuclear weapons because they saw no military utility to those weapons and they saw maybe a fleeting political function. And then on the other end you had some newer alliance members on the eastern flank who wanted to preserve the status quo and who didn't want to signal to Russia any weakening of this nuclear transatlantic bond that these bombs represented. And so these were the underlying debates that sort of made it into the public eye around those years between 2010 and 2012. And as I'm commenting on this, it's not lost on me that this is a debate that NATO allies and certainly the elites within the NATO capitals really hate having, because not only is it divisive within an alliance setting, but in countries like Germany and other countries like Turkey as well, the presence of these American tactical nuclear weapons on their soil is quite controversial. In fact, there's very little public support for it. So they view this as a bit of a hot potato issue, and they'd rather not have the debate if they can avoid it, because they view it as potentially politically costly. In the DDPR, I thought I would give you a bit the structure of the document. So it was released at the 2012 summit, NATO Alliance Summit in Chicago, and it is broken down in terms of categories. And the underlying question of the document is NATO getting the appropriate mix of capabilities it needs to fulfill the alliance's mandate? And so it's broken down between nuclear forces, conventional forces, missile defense, has a section on arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation. And the basic answer to the question in the document is that, yes, NATO has the right mix, or has the appropriate mix of capabilities, and it's basically a status quo document. But there are some important nuances in the text, and since we've already underscored the fact that language is very important and words matter, I thought I would put up a few quotes from the DDPR. So you see some similar language here that echoes the language that I previously showed in the strategic concept from 2010 about NATO being a nuclear alliance. But you also have this nod, this acknowledgement that there is a debate within the alliance about the viability of the current nuclear sharing arrangements, and opening the door to perhaps the alliance reducing its reliance on non-strategic nuclear weapons, those that are based in Europe. But overall, it's a strong status quo document. Then what you have, and as Stephanie Carvin alluded to, is a major change in the security environment. And although the relationship between NATO and Russia wasn't perfectly rosy, prior to 2014, the relationship definitely takes a turn for the worse with the annexation of Crimea and the instability that is fostered in eastern Ukraine. And so here you see that the Wales Summit communique of 2014 takes rather stern language to condemn the actions of Russia. And here's where we start to see a shift in NATO's defense and deterrence posture, but only slightly so. In the Warsaw Summit of 2016, so 2 years ago, that was the latest summit, you see that definitely the emphasis on the reliance of American tactical nuclear weapons in Europe is underscored. And this was certainly something that observers at the summit noticed immediately when the communique was released. And you also have this statement on the idea that any employment of nuclear weapons against NATO would fundamentally alter the nature of conflict, which is a nod to the perceived change in Russia's nuclear doctrine and what's typically referred to as escalating to de-escalate. This idea that Russia might preemptively use its nuclear forces, or the threat of use of nuclear forces in a crisis with NATO, to halt or force an end to a particular crisis or conflict with NATO. So to me, these paragraphs and these responses are a bit of an adaptation to the perceived changes in Russia's nuclear doctrine and this escalate to de-escalate mentality. Another notable change in the same communique is with regards to disarmament and arms control with Russia. So whereas before in official policy documents of NATO's and previous communiques, you saw this opening for a disarmament dialogue with Russia when it comes to this category of weapons and non-strategic weapons. And we could have a long debate about whether they're indeed non-strategic or they're now considered to be strategic, but I'm going to leave that aside for now. But here it's noted quite clearly that there are no political conditions that would lead to achieving disarmament over the issue of non-strategic nuclear weapons. And so the door is temporarily closed so long as some of the other political issues are not resolved. So this is just to underscore that between 2002, when Vladimir Putin had very nice things to say about the prospects for deeper cooperation between NATO and Russia, talking about a common security area from Vancouver to Vladivostok, to 2018, we've seen a big change in the regional security environment. And although this has had some implications for the nuclear doctrine of NATO and NATO's nuclear weapons policy, these have been rather minor. And what I would offer in terms of a basic argument is that no one at NATO wants to have a public debate about this. And even if the DDPR as a document should perhaps be updated to reflect the new security environment, or to reflect that Russia has gone from a partner to an adversary, there is no one that wants to have this debate because of what I alluded to earlier. Even though there's strong elite consensus now in favor of maintaining a nuclear status quo, and this status quo has been basically reinforced by Russia's actions, when it comes to the domestic publics of NATO, there are still some strong anti-nuclear sentiments. So this would be divisive and would potentially create an appearance of a lack of cohesion within NATO when it comes to this issue. So I think this is definitely a debate that NATO allies want to kick further down the road if they're forced to have this particular discussion. And I also want to mention, since I'm running out of time, that echoing what was said earlier, there isn't a close parity of military capabilities between Russia and the United States, and that much is clear. And the nuclear dimension is the only area, basically, where Russia still has parity in terms of capabilities with the United States. And so I would offer that the discussions surrounding reduced reliance on nuclear forces within the NATO context serve to perhaps undermine that component of Russia's capabilities. And so the more you de-emphasize nuclear weapons, either through the 2009 Prague speech or within NATO's nuclear weapons policy and doctrine, the more you're casting a shadow on Russia's source of pride when it comes to measuring up its capabilities against the United States or the alliances, and that is nuclear weapons.